Hello, my name is Antonio Reid. I'm in association with Climate Matters and Stuart Scott's programming. Today we are here with Jeff Baradelli. He's a meteorologist at West Palm Beach, South Florida. Jeff?
Hey Antonio, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I want to start the conversation off about talking about climate change and more specifically sea level rise and what that means for the people of South Florida and West Palm Beach in your meteorological opinion.
Well, first of all, yeah, I worked in both the Miami market and now I'm in the West Palm Beach market. I lived on South Beach, on Miami Beach for many years. And it's surprising when you walk out the door on a sunny day and there's like a foot of water on the ground. We call that sunny day or fair weather nuisance flooding. And it happens often in the intersections of like West Avenue and Alton Road in Miami Beach, but not just there, also in the downtown Fort Lauderdale area, especially towards the beach. And it can happen also in parts of Palm Beach County. So it's already happening. Now, in Miami Beach, they're mitigating. They're spending $500 million to kind of raise the roads and install pumps. But nevertheless, as sea level rise accelerates, it's going to be harder and harder to adapt. And one key thing to understand about South Florida, we cannot build a wall to keep the water out. It actually percolates through the aquifer, or I should say the calcium carbonate under the ground. It's all very porous material down there. And unfortunately, we can't stop the water from coming in from that way. So all we can really do is raise the ground. And that's what they're doing in Miami Beach. But as you can imagine, that's a Herculean task. And it's going to happen regardless. We know that we baked in a certain amount of warming, certain amount of climate change, certain amount of, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the sea level rise is going to continue to rise, but it would be nice to keep it at bay as best as we can, because the more sea level rise we have, the more money it's going to cost to mitigate and the more people that will be displaced inland.
So let me ask you, since the pre-industrial period, how much sea level rise has South Florida experienced?
It's been about 8, 9 inches so far, and the rate at which it's happening is accelerating. The estimate is by 2050 we could see another foot. Again, that's very much an estimate. It could be a little less, it could be a little more. By 2100, some of the scenarios have us just gaining another 2 feet on top of where we are right now, which still would be very bad, but it would be better than 6 or 7 feet, which is some of the worst case scenario measurements. Even I've heard estimates of 8 feet. I think that's probably pretty high. It seems doubtful, but the one thing that we don't know is we don't know how unstable Antarctica and Greenland are. So because of that, we really don't know what's going to happen by 2100. Planning for 2050 is a little bit easier because it's 30 years away. One of the things you should consider, though, is it's not so much sea level rise is a big factor, but anticipation of sea level rise is a complicating issue for people who own property near the ocean, because the mortgage companies will just say at some point they're going to say, well, it's too risky to issue a mortgage, so we're going to stop issuing mortgages on certain properties. Once that happens, your property becomes much less valued, if not fairly useless, except for your own means.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what sea level rise projections are. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is projecting almost 3 feet of sea level rise by 2060. Dr. James Hansen, he's the former director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, NASA, and his team are projecting in their latest 2015 paper anywhere between 3 to 5 meters of sea level rise within the next 50 to 150 years. I was just on the phone with Dr. James White. He's the paleoclimatologist at the Alpine and Arctic Research Institute, University of Colorado Boulder. He described the situation in South Florida that with 2 feet of sea level rise, so much saltwater intrusion and submersion of water pipes, electrical wiring, gas pipelines would happen in the city of Miami that essentially it'd be totally inoperable around 2 feet of sea level rise.
Yeah, there are a lot of complications that we can project them out. We can try to plan for them. There are circumstances that'll pop up that we just didn't expect. The one thing I would say is, I heard the numbers you quoted. I think that there's some debate as to how much sea level rise is going to occur. There are these low-end estimates and high-end estimates. The ones that I generally think fall somewhere in the middle of the road. There's there's one estimate that a lot of people go by here in South Florida, which is somewhere around, I believe, 20 inches or so by 2060, maybe a little more than that, maybe close to 2 feet. I quoted closer to 1 foot by 2050, but 2 feet by 2060 is not out of the question. However, some of the numbers that you just mentioned, like 3 to 5 meters, that's exceptional. I hadn't heard of numbers that high by 2100. And you're sure that's meters and not feet, right?
This is Dr. James Hansen's latest paper in 2015, Sea Level Rise and Ice Melt. He is the atmospheric scientist and physicist and paleoclimatologist and climatologist at Columbia's Earth
Right.
Institute.
Yeah. I'm not. I mean, look, there are different estimates from different scientists out there, but boy, if he's right, and James Hansen, is one of the godfathers of modern day climate change science, then it would be a lot more precarious here in South Florida. I have to hope that those projections are overestimates, but again, he would be more of an expert.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their 2013 AR5 Assessment Report 5 predicted almost 1.5 meters of sea level rise by 2100. That's over
Right.
3 feet of sea level rise by that time.
Right. So that's less than what James Hansen's predicting. If what you're saying, 3 to 5 minutes. Okay. All right. Anyway, either any of those numbers are not good for us, but certainly we'd like it to be on the lower end, Antonio.
So what does it mean then to prepare? Because the way that I understand this is really when you talk about coastal cities, regardless if we're getting 3 feet or 6 feet, those numbers seem to be mute. 2 feet of sea level rise renders a city like Miami nearly inoperable due to the saltwater intrusion.
Mm-hmm.
So what do? You just can't continue to raise the roads indefinitely, can you?
I think you're right. I think at some point you do eventually get chased out. There are a lot of people who argue that technology will catch up. We can only hope. We don't really know exactly what technology is going to bring. It would be, I can't, in my mind, think of a way that we could come back, from, 4, 5, 6 feet of sea level rise. 2 feet it's conceivable that Miami can get through 2 feet. They're already planning for 2 feet by installing pumps and by raising the ground. They probably could raise the ground a little more, put in a couple more pumps, maybe buy themselves some extra time. As far as the saltwater intrusion goes into the aquifer, that's a difficult one. What you mentioned, infrastructure under the ground and how that might survive. Again, it's going to require a ton of money. The one thing to keep in mind, Antonio, is that you will often hear people argue that there's so much money in Miami Beach and Miami, so many very rich people, and so much to lose that Miami and Miami Beach will find a way technologically and whatever tax money they need to raise to actually make it happen. I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that with enough money, you can probably at least buy yourself some time. Whether you can ever really save the city, that's probably not likely once it gets past a certain threshold. That threshold was, could be 2 to 3 feet, but it could be 5 to 6 feet. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, I also wanted to expand on the fact that right now, according to NASA, we are at somewhere between 400 and 410 parts per million of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The long-run equilibrium for sea level rise for carbon dioxide numbers like that in the atmosphere is between 20 to 40 meters of sea level rise. So essentially what we're talking about in South Florida is an issue of not if, but when. People in South Florida are going to have to consider, and I don't want to sound too hyperbolic, but abandoning parts of the state.
Yeah, I think that might be inevitable. Maybe that happens around 2100, especially if it's close to the water, obviously. Maybe it's later, maybe it's earlier. I mean, it all depends upon how fast sea level rise happens, how unstable Antarctica gets, and Greenland. So yeah, I mean, look, it's certainly not good news in the long run. You and me might be gone. We might still kind of be around, and on our last leg, because it should happen hopefully later in our lives. But yeah, there's no doubt it's a big concern for South Florida, and one of the problems that we have is that South Floridians see it happening. When you survey people, and across America, and you say, do you think you've experienced climate change yourself? People in South Florida will say, yes, I've seen it. People in other parts of the country will say, I'm not sure. I don't think so. I don't think I've experienced climate change. So there's a disconnect between people who live near the water who know they've seen climate change, Hurricane Harvey in Houston, or just general sea level rise in places like Miami, and other parts of the country where people have yet to really notice it, just because it doesn't impact their day-to-day life.
Well, let me also ask you more about the meteorology. Hurricanes. Last year, we watched Hurricane Harvey park over Houston and dump 50 inches of water. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us for every degree Celsius of temperature rise, we would expect anywhere between 5 to 7% more moisture in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. Are we talking about much more severe flooding caused by rainstorms alone, minus sea level rise, or not considering sea level rise?
Yeah, absolutely. That's, I think, one of the most immediate impacts, and something we can say is already impacting us, is this idea that there's more water vapor in the atmosphere because air temperatures are now warmer. We've seen air temperatures go up about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1850, let's say. And so that's about 1 degree Celsius. So we already have factored in, like you said, 5 to 7% more water vapor into the atmosphere. Kevin Tremberth of NCAR estimates that Hurricane Harvey produced probably 15%, maybe 20% more rain just because of climate change. Now, it's not just because the atmosphere can hold more moisture. It's also likely because there's some evidence pointing to the fact that tropical cyclones are actually slowing down a little bit, just a little bit, but just a little bit is all we need. Remember, if you've already had 40 inches of rain, you get an extra 10 inches of rain. There's it doesn't sound like a lot more, but there were people that might not have been flooded with 40 inches, however that's possible, but they will be flooded with 50. So now you're flooding an extra 100,000 homes or 50,000 homes or 10,000 homes, whatever it is. Your losses economically and in terms of livelihoods are a lot more impactful.
And let me ask you then, talking about global warming generally, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is predicting in its 2013 assessment that we're going to reach 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise by the middle of the century. And we're going to reach almost 4 degrees Celsius temperature rise by the end of the century. The only caveat I would add to that is that regardless of scenario, including the 8.5 scenario, RCP, mm-hmm. Right. Temperatures between 2010 and 2017 have all been above all of the IPCC's projections so mm-hmm. far.
Yeah, so you're worried that that trend will continue and that we'll always end up above their projections, their estimates of 2 degrees. You're saying 2 degrees Celsius by 2050, 4 degrees Celsius by 2100, right?
That's what IPCC 2013 is saying.
Well, of course, we're trying to avoid 2 Celsius. Most scientists agree that it's going to be extraordinarily challenging, if not almost impossible. One thing that is said is if we can't take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere right now, then we're never going to make that 2 degrees Celsius threshold, meaning, carbon sequestration or just pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That's going to be a vital component. You're hearing about that more and more over the past year or two, that we absolutely are going to need to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that's already there. We're also going to have to try to sequester it and take it out of any of the fossil fuel plants that are producing it right now. Try to figure out technologies that may do that on a wider scale, just essentially stopping the carbon dioxide from getting into the atmosphere, not just taking it out of the atmosphere. And the problem with that is that the technology is not quite there yet, not at mass scale. So although we're relying on this so that we can stay at around 2 degrees Celsius or below, it's not yet proven to be technology that can be massively scaled up. And when I say massive, it would be a massive undertaking, a lot of cooperation between nations, which is not an easy thing to accomplish, and tremendous amounts of money to get that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, with that said, there's probably some money to be made in sequestering carbon dioxide, products that could be made from that. So maybe someone will come up with a viable business model in the next 5 or 10 years that will make it a profitable business. And once it becomes a profitable business, you no longer need countries to chip in. You can just let the private enterprise kind of take over. But again, a lot of this is hearsay. A lot of this is hope but not necessarily a definite. And unfortunately, we absolutely have to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to stay below 2C. If we don't, there will be some fairly drastic consequences to climate change, especially once we get past 2050.
Another comment on carbon sequestering from the atmosphere, or carbon drawdown, or carbon removal is what it's been called. The IPCC, in its 2013 assessment, did say that climate change is irreversible in the absence of large geoengineering of the Earth's atmosphere. But they also conclude that so far, no geoengineering schemes are viable.
Right.
Kevin Anderson, he's a climate scientist out of the UK, estimated that we would have to draw down 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year if we were going to have meaningful effects that people living today would feel by the end of the century.
I mean, it's a Herculean is the word I would use. A Herculean task, there's no doubt about that. Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be easy. There's no doubt about that, but it's something that we absolutely need to do. I mean, failure is not an option, is what I would say.
What about the idea, the IPCC also looks at this idea, solar radiation management, SRM, throwing aerosols into the lower stratosphere to reflect sunlight?
What do I think about it? I think it's risky. I think it's a good idea, but the problem is what happens when you stop doing that? All of a sudden, the temperature goes up what it was supposed to anyway. So instead of going up gradually, 1, 2, 3 degrees Celsius, you don't see any. If you throw enough sulfate up there, enough aerosols up there, your temperature may remain steady, kind of like allowing a lot of volcanoes to erupt. But then all of a sudden, let's say countries stop cooperating, or for some reason we stop putting the aerosols up in the stratosphere. Then all of a sudden the temperature goes straight like that. It just jumps within a couple of years because these aerosol particles don't stay suspended for very long.
And actually,
so it's a risky scenario.
I want to talk a little bit hammering on that because we already are, through industrial civilization, creating an anthropogenic volcano. Our coal burning in China, the United States, Europe, and elsewhere is already releasing sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. So aren't we experiencing a global dimming effect already, kind of as an unintended consequence of industrial production?
A little bit, but a lot of that stuff stays in the troposphere and then just rains out. It doesn't get up into the stratosphere. We need to get it up higher into the atmosphere so it stays suspended for a prolonged period of time. I mean, these aerosols, especially in the troposphere, they don't last very long. They just essentially fall back into the ground or the ocean or rain down from clouds. So, yeah, I mean, to some degree, but it's not getting to where it needs to be, and it needs to stay suspended up there.
Yeah. Okay. And kind of just going toward concluding our interview here, and I thank you again for your time.
Sure.
So sea level rises, or at least the NOAA projection of 6 feet by the end of the century, 3 feet by 2060, is based on staying at 2 degrees Celsius. It's based on the mid-range ICP, RCPs 4.5 and 6.0. The highest in there is 3.1 degrees Celsius by 2100. Right now, the International Energy Agency is estimating that if we are committed to Paris, and of course we are not, the United States at least, if the world stays committed, we'll get at least 3 to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So we are potentially looking at much faster sea level rise depending on what we do with our carbon emissions today.
Yeah, I mean, we cannot stay on the 8.5 course. That's not an option. And if we do, we're in big trouble. I mean, of course, it would be nicer to stay much lower. And I think that we're just trying to be optimistic here and hope that business and government can figure this out in the next couple of decades so that we can stay near 2. I don't really know that we can stay below 2. Most scientists believe that it's almost impossible to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. So we may have to abandon that ship, that hope that we're going to stay below 2C. But, a lot depends upon the actions that we see. I mean, there's some reason for optimism here, right? I mean, in the United States, cities and states are kind of taking some leadership roles. So are corporations. There's some of that going on. Also, solar, the price of solar is going down tremendously. The price of battery is going down tremendously. Most of the investment in 2018 has been into the solar industry rather than into any other fossil fuels in terms of producing mass power. And it's creating a ton of jobs. I mean, if you want to create jobs, the way to do it is solar energy because, solar, I believe, I have to get the exact numbers, but solar itself now employs 3 times the amount of people that fossil fuels does. Now, I might be wrong. It may be solar plus wind. I can't remember exactly. But still, sustainable energy employs more than 3 times the amount of people that fossil fuels does. It's creating a lot more jobs, and it's creating them a lot faster. So if you think about it that way, we may get to a point where there's a kind of a breakaway moment where all of a sudden there's this acceleration into sustainable forms of living, especially in energy and in cars as well, because cars is becoming a bigger factor even than the production of energy, as you probably have read. What it used to be the energy sector producing most of the carbon dioxide, now actually, transportation has overcome that by a little bit. So that's where we lag, and that's where we need to put our emphasis in the next few years. But again, like I said, we just don't know what kind of technology is coming. We have to be optimistic, and we know that failure is not an option. Unfortunately, we may fail, but of course, I hope we don't.
Well, the last thing I want to talk about before we close is the political will. Right now, we're living in 2 years of what people have called the Trumpocene. We're living in a time where the United States, the richest country in the world, one of the most developed countries in the world, almost a quarter of its population denies that climate change is happening at all.
Mm-hmm.
And we have right now a climate change denying president. And from my understanding, in the great state of Florida, we have a governor who denies climate change and has restricted the use of the word climate change for public officials in the state. Can you just make a comment on really the state of mind people of the 21st century are in, particularly here in the United States?
I don't understand it, to be honest with you. There's a lot of skepticism as it pertains to science, especially as it pertains to climate change. Generally speaking, it does have to do with politics. At some point, this became a partisan issue. There's a lot of money that goes into skepticism of climate change. Again, I wish I knew, to be honest with you, and I wish I could shed some light onto it. As a scientist, of course, I believe climate change is real, and I believe that it's mainly caused by man. But I can't really speak for other people. I don't know why they think what they think. But there's definitely a skepticism of scientists, and most of it seems to be, at least when you look at surveys, caused by a political divide in the country. I will say that a lot of people who live in these places that have less acceptance of climate change, especially when it comes to like agriculture and farmers, they're starting to see things change. And they may not say the words climate change ever. You might not ever hear that out of their mouths. But what they will say is drought is affecting them, and some people may say floods are affecting them more than they did before. So although they may not be admitting to, believing in climate change, I think there's a whole lot of people out there that know it's happening. They're just not going to say that they know it's happening. But the bottom line is, if you're a farmer and there's a big drought on your farm and it's being caused by climate change, you're going to have to make some changes. Otherwise, you're going to cease to have a business many years down the road. So I don't know what's causing the political divide. I don't know why, this has to be a partisan issue. I wish it wasn't. It would make my life and everyone's life a lot easier. But it does exist. It's a reality of our world, and hopefully we can come together. If we can actually come to an agreement, I think business will push us in that direction. Economics in this country, capitalist country, really dictates mostly everything.
But
So,
just a quick comment, isn't it business? Isn't it the commercial spirit that is actually causing part of the problem in the first place? We have industries like Coke industry going to states like Arizona and pushing the legislator to put a utility fee on using solar panels.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we just put a tariff on solar panels from China. It seems to me that we have a lot of business interests that are moving in the opposite direction. Under the Obama administration, we had Shell put a $500 million oil rig in the Arctic to begin its oil exploration. Fortunately, the storms in the Arctic had brought the drill rig down. But they have plans in the future to explore oil and gas in the Arctic. So that's what I don't understand. It seems to me that business is pushing us, at least some businesses are pushing us in the wrong direction.
And that's the key. Some businesses, there are competing business interests, and it's just a matter of turning the tide, right? Whenever something becomes a lot cheaper, ultimately that's the business model that's going to end up working. People want cheap, and you can only push back on that so much. You can only put so much money in as a competitive company saying, I don't want solar to move forward. I don't want wind to move forward. When all the jobs are in solar and all the jobs are in wind, and it's cheaper for people to get their power that way. And when gas is $3, $4 a gallon, as opposed to having a Prius or an electric car, more people migrate in that direction. So I think ultimately you can't really stop capitalism, and you can't stop the most profitable company. So as the profit starts to shift, I think business will lend a helping hand, if you will. For right now, we're stuck in that battle. It's a battle between businesses. It's a battle between political wills. And I wish I had the answer as to how this is going to all turn out, but I don't know. I can only hope for the best.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff Baradelli, for being with us today. Again, my name is Antonio Reid, in association with Climate Matters and Stuart Scott. Thank you for the programming.
Thank you.